deadliest act of anti-Semitism in our nation's history in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After those killings, in the hours that followed, people from all faiths came together at the corner of Forbes and Murray, which is like the epicenter of the Squirrel Hill neighborhood in Pittsburgh, hand in hand, praying for one another, singing together, bringing comfort to one another, and saying in that community that we would be stronger than hate. The lines of religion blurred, but the lines of faith connected all of us.
Welcome. We are so thrilled to have you all here. I'm Lily Rabinoff-Goldman. I'm the President and CEO here at JCC Greater Boston. We are thrilled to welcome you here tonight. You don't know that this is actually our first event back at our recently renovated Weaver Goldstein Theater, and we could not have imagined a more epic re-entry into this amazing space. So thank you for being here. We, of course, are all here tonight for this special program with Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, who will be sharing personal insights from his new book, Where We Keep the Light, Stories from a Life of Service. Tonight, we are privileged to hear directly from Governor Shapiro about some of the toughest and most pivotal moments of his life, as well as stories about his family, his faith, his childhood, and the experiences that have shaped him into the leader he is today. A key takeaway from Governor Shapiro's book is the powerful reminder that there is more that unites us as Americans and as a community than divides us. And I will say that for us here at the JCC, where our core values are belonging, collaboration, transformation, and joy, that is an incredibly resonant message. We are also fortunate and very thrilled to have one of America's most highly respected journalists, Marty Baron, leading tonight's conversation. Marty served as executive editor of the Washington Post from January 2013 until his retirement in February 2021. Before the Post, he was editor of the Boston Globe, where he oversaw the Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into sexual abuse in the Catholic Church that inspired the Oscar-winning film Spotlight. To lead off this evening, we are honored to be joined by our own Massachusetts Governor, Maura Healey, who will share a few words to open our program. Yeah! We are very grateful for Governor Healey's presence here tonight, her steadfast leadership, and her dedication to justice, inclusion, and public service. So, without further ado, I will hand things over to Governor Healey. Thank you all for being here.
Good evening, Lily, and members of this wonderful, wonderful JCC community. Thank you for hosting this tonight. I'm excited for the conversation, and I'm excited to see all of you out, dug out of snow, get a little bit this weekend. I was trying to explain to Governor Shapiro a little bit about that. I want to thank Lily and the team here for the work and the many contributions made to the greater community day out, day in and day out in so many ways. I also see a certain Robert Kraft here tonight. Now, what happened on the field in Denver, talk about snow, is something we appreciate, we're also excited about. And, you know, there are two things we know about New England. It snows in January, and the Patriots always head to the Super Bowl. So it's great to see. I also know that for all of his accomplishments and for all that the New England Patriots have done and achieved here, I think that the thing that means most to Robert Kraft is his effort to combat anti-Semitism and hate. That's so for however many rings you have and are going to get, I know that that will be your proudest legacy, Robert, and I thank you for that, and thank you for your leadership. And then, of course, we have Marty Baron back in town. An incredible force in journalism, and that voice in journalism and investigative reporting, and a commitment to the First Amendment and the free press is so appreciated and needs to be affirmed, right, and celebrated. And Governor Shapiro, okay? Governor Shapiro, my dear friend and colleague, a needed voice of reason, of resolve, of common sense, and so needed in this time. Governor Shapiro is always welcome in Massachusetts, of course. I've invited him to be an honorary Patriots fan right now, and he said yes. No, he didn't. Don't worry. You know, I remember my first bet with him as AG. It was 2018. Yeah, I had to wear the wrong jersey. I lost, but we'll get it back. Governor Shapiro and I do go back, and I just, want to say a few things. It's true, we both love sports. We're constantly rousing each other. He's getting, all this acclaim and press right now, but you should see his texts to me. They're pretty vicious when the Celtics and the Sixers play, for real. It's a great, healthy rivalry. I insist that Massachusetts is the birthplace of American democracy, and Philly just took care of the paperwork. He takes great offense to that. Has laid me out publicly for that comment. We had a chance to work together as attorneys general, as the people's lawyers. And I was with Josh, forgive me, as we stood shoulder to shoulder, taking on Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family, on behalf of so many families devastated by the opioid crisis. I cheered him on when he opened that pivotal grand jury investigation into the clergy sex abuse scandal in Pennsylvania, something that Marty Baron brought to light here years ago in Massachusetts. And I've just seen the power of his work, his commitment to public service as Attorney General, and now, of course, as Governor. On day one, of course, he announced that hiring in Pennsylvania was truly open to all by going to skills-based hiring. You remember that? He cut taxes, something I was proud to do. Reminder to everybody, I too am running for election this year. and then that bridge, okay? How about that? So, he's done a lot of great things as governor of another commonwealth, and a commonwealth where there are differences and there are divides and there are different regions and sectors and sensibilities and all of that. Not too dissimilar from Massachusetts, but there's a reason that Pennsylvania is ground zero when it comes to presidential elections. And Governor Shapiro, I admire him for a lot. He's been able to navigate that, right? And be somebody who has an ear for everyone, listens to everyone, and is working to get things done. I left out the swear word, but you know what I mean. So tonight we're here to hear from him about his important book, Where We Keep the Light. Yesterday, some of us gathered for International Holocaust Remembrance Day in the State House. And of course, we talked about the frightening rise of anti-Semitic speech, anti-Semitic violence, and about the obligation that we all have to denounce hatred in all forms. I'm proud that we were able to appoint here a commission on anti-Semitism and are right now preparing to implement those recommendations. But, it made me think about Governor Shapiro as I was talking yesterday, and we were listening to the words of a Holocaust survivor speak, putting this all in context, and just looking out and knowing how real and visceral this is. And, we think about, I thought right away about Josh and his experience, horrifying experience that he and his family went through last April. And I know that coming to terms with that experience and understanding its meaning in the context of national and global politics is something he's thought a lot about, he talks about in this book. And it puts into stark relief the work that we're trying to do collectively right now and what's at stake. We can't fail this, and we can't fail in this moment. And I really appreciated Josh's insights in his book. So in terms of educating us all and educating the public in a truly deep and meaningful way, personal way, in a way that I think a lot of people can relate to, Governor Shapiro has just done an amazing job with the storytelling of his experience in this book. And he's also done tremendous work through public service. So I want to thank him for making the trip north. I look forward to the conversation. And no matter who we're rooting for any given day on the court or on the playing field, Governor Shapiro is somebody who, like all of us, roots for America, roots for the greatest country in the world. With that, we welcome Josh Shapiro and Marty Baron.
I just want to say to the governor before she leaves, not only do I appreciate her, but we are proud of our paperwork in the city.
Great. Well, Governor, it's great to be with you. Great opportunity. We actually met in 2018. You had overseen as Attorney General a grand jury report that highlighted, found an enormous amount of sexual abuse among clergy in Pennsylvania, more than 1,000 victims, perhaps some multiple of that, by 300 priests since the 1950s. And I want to get to that subject. We have that experience in common of looking at that subject. But I want to start with something else. So, many politicians have written about their Christian faith, particularly evangelicals. But you centered it, but I don't know very many, if any, by the way, who have actually written about their Jewish faith. And you have centered this book on your Jewish faith. And I want to ask you why you did that.
Well, first off, let me just say I'm honored and humbled that you're all here this evening, and thank you for buying my book, and thank you for taking a few minutes to hear from me. I wrote about my faith because I'm proud of my faith. I also wrote about my faith because it is central to who I am. My mom and dad raised me to be someone to be aware of the world around me, to try and help people in this world. My mom introduced me to the plight of Soviet Jewish refugees. My dad showed me the needs of kids without health care in our community. And as a little boy, I learned the need to help others. I learned from my faith that no one is required to complete the task, but neither are we free to refrain from it. Those central values in my upbringing are what lead me to this seat here today. As a governor, as a public servant, as a father, and as a husband, it is who I am. I will tell you, Marty, as you read about my faith and the way I talk about it, to me it is less about the dogma of religion, but rather the universality of faith, the need to help others who are hungry, the need to put a roof over the head of those who are unhoused, the need to care for thy neighbor and love thy neighbor. And in many ways, while I'm talking about my journey through my faith, what I have found is by being open and proud of my faith, it has brought me closer to people of other faiths. It has brought me closer to people from different walks of life who are grounded in other things. I'm not here to preach at anybody, and I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I think it's important that people know what you believe and what grounds you, and that's what I wrote about in this book.
So you note in the book that many Jewish Americans are reluctant to actually publicly demonstrate their faith. And I'm wondering why you think that is. Is it a matter of fear for their safety, or is there something else at play there?
I think there's no question that there has been a rise in anti-Semitism. And even shy of anti-Semitism, there has been a feeling of pressure where folks who are Jewish are reluctant to share their faith openly. Sometimes it starts by not wearing a Star of David you might have worn before. Sometimes it might be not showing up at your synagogue or not speaking up when you see something happening to others. And to me, that is why it's incredibly important that Robert Kraft do what he does and what this blue square represents, and why to me, it was important, particularly after October 7th, to lead more openly and proudly about who I am. Not to try and convince someone to go to synagogue or believe what I believe, but to have a level of comfort that they can be themselves if I'm out being myself. I remember I write about it in the book at Jimmy Carter's funeral. Someone who had worked for Jimmy Carter, their grandson, came over to me and just said to me how scared he was, but how comforted he felt that I'm living my life openly like this, and that offers him some strength and him some comfort. And so to me, I feel a responsibility at this point in my life, with everything going on, to live openly and proudly and hopefully offer others some comfort in the process.
So people who've written about politics have already suggested that centering this book on Judaism is risky for you politically, particularly to have higher political ambitions, given the divisive impact of the conflict in Gaza. And the Democratic Party, as you well know, is sharply dividing on support for Israel. Has dropped dramatically. So I'm wondering whether you see that as risky in the way that they use, and is the subject of Israel an unbridgeable divide in the Democratic Party?
I think there's two different conversations that need to be had on this topic. The first conversation is about anti-Semitism and faith. And to me, that's a very black and white conversation. There should be no room for anti-Semitism in our society. There should be no room for hatred or bigotry in any form. That is a very black and white, clear-cut issue, and one that we have a lot of work to do on. The second conversation is about Israel policy and Middle Eastern policy, and to me, that is a very nuanced conversation. I'm someone who has strongly held beliefs. I've been highly critical of this government in Israel, but I'm also someone who believes in Israel's right to exist and supports Israel's right to exist. I think it is important when we have this dialogue, and I know some of the political reporters blur this together, I'm not accusing you of that, is that they just kind of blend.
I'm unemployed at the moment.
They blend all of that together and suggest you're Jewish, you must believe this about Israel, you must believe this about that. And to me, that's a separate and distinct conversation, which I'm happy to have, but I think it's important to keep those two things separate.
Well, I may want to come back on that so that you can elaborate on that a bit more. So do you believe that well, first of all, within the Democratic Party, that a Jewish politician can actually win the nomination of the party? And do you think that this country is prepared to elect someone who's Jewish as president of the United States?
I think this country is prepared to elect someone who can get stuff done for them, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, who they love, or who they pray to, period. I think this country is made up of good people who just want their elected leaders to stop pontificating and start getting stuff done. I will share with you, as I write in this book, my experience in Pennsylvania, being open about my faith. And I think we can all agree, notwithstanding Maura giving me a hard time about being from the other Commonwealth, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is sort of the epicenter of politics. I think Republicans and Democrats agree it is the swingiest of all swing states. As I was preparing to run for governor, we thought about how we wanted to go about kind of reintroducing me to the voters. You kind of have a choice. You can talk about an issue that you want to run on. You can talk about your opponent in an ad. I chose to run my first ad talking about my family and my faith, centered around where I am every Friday night, and that is around the Shabbat or the Sabbath dinner table in our home. I ran that ad, and a whole bunch of political consultants said, "You're crazy to run it. People are going to know you're Jewish." I'm like, I think they know I'm Jewish. But what was remarkable about Marty was after we ran that ad, I'd show up in some of our rural communities. We have 67 counties, Pennsylvania, roughly 58 of them are rural communities. I'd show up in some of those where I'd increase the Jewish population by 100%. And folks would come over to me and they'd say, "I saw your ad. That was amazing. Let me tell you what lunch is like after church on Sunday. I want to tell you about our Christmas Eve dinner." I'd have folks coming up to me telling me about their iftar celebrations and what that was like for them. In a way, because I was open about who I am, they became more open about who they were. And in that election, I earned more votes than anybody in the history of our county. I share that with you, not to pat myself on the back, I share that with you to pat on the back the good people of Pennsylvania. I think the American people reflect those same values. If you are true to who you are, if you let them know you're grounded in something, if you let them know what your values are and how those values are going to positively impact their lives, then I think the American people are willing to sign up for that, or others who demonstrate similarly.
So given your confidence that someone who is Jewish could get the nomination of the Democratic Party, could become president of the United States, would you by any chance have an interest in being that person?
See how you
Just
set
for-
me up to it.
I did. Just for argument's sake, in, I don't know, 2028 or something like that.
Let me say this. I'm running for re-election in 2026 for governor of Pennsylvania, and I would caution anyone in this room to be thinking about 2028. Our country's on fire right now. We are seeing a level of chaos and cruelty and corruption that is unprecedented. And I know a whole bunch of you here in this room probably turn off the TV because you can't take it. You pull up the covers and you just hope it'll go away. And to me, that's not going to work. We need active engagement of all of our citizens across this country in these midterms to begin to curtail this cruelty of the Trump administration. And I would submit to all of you, we don't have the luxury of looking toward 2028. And I would also say to you that these midterms don't only matter in the swing states or the swing districts. I think we need a national referendum on what we are seeing in Washington, D.C. right now, even in districts here that are foregone conclusions. You show up, Maura Healey gets reelected with 50% voter turnout, that's nice. But imagine the message it sends when she gets reelected and there was 90% turnout. And we see that across the country. That's how we send a message. We got to focus on these midterms.
Well, I want to thank you for recommending that people keep reading the news. Appreciate that. So after I read the book, I sent you an email saying you made some news in this book toward the end of the book, and sure enough, that's the news that it made primarily. And the news focuses on what you were asked by aides to Kamala Harris and Harris herself when you were being interviewed about possibly becoming her vice presidential running mate. And I have to say that some of the questions that were posed to you startled me as well. So you talked about, you said they spent a lot of time asking me about Israel. And you write that I wondered whether these questions were being posed to just me, the only Jewish guy in the running, or if everyone who had not held a federal office was being grilled about Israel in the same way. You said they were unsure of how our positions were going to blend. They asked me how I thought my views were going to play in Michigan with such a large Arab American population. Dana Remus, who was running the vetting process, asked, have you ever been an agent of the Israeli government? And asked, have you ever communicated with an undercover agent of Israel? And you said the fact that she asked or was told to ask that question by someone else said a lot about some of the people around the VP. And then Kamala Harris herself asked you whether you'd be willing to apologize for Middle East statements related to the Middle East that you made, particularly your criticisms of Gaza-related protests at the University of Pennsylvania. So some Jewish leaders, having read that, have said that that represented classic anti-Semitism. And what I want to ask you is whether you believe that represented, whether those remarks and those questions were anti-Semitic by their very nature, and did it suggest to you that they bought into this trope of the divided loyalties of Jews in America?
First, let me explain why I included that chapter in this book, and then let me get to answer your question. Throughout this book, I write about how I've struggled as a public servant to find the best way to serve and balance that with trying to be a good husband and a good father to our 4 children. And it's a constant struggle, and I constantly feel like I'm coming up short as a dad or short as a husband because I'm not dedicating enough time to them while also feeling passionate about serving others. And there have been times in my life where folks have tried to encourage me to run for this or do that, and Lori, my wife Lori, and I have made a decision to do that. And so this was yet another example of that proverbial fork in the road where there were a whole lot of folks pushing us one direction. And to me, as I went through that process, it was critically important that I align my head, my heart, and my gut into trying to make the decision where I could be the best father and husband, serve the public the best way, and help my country. And what I write about in that chapter is the struggle that I went through to find that alignment. And I also wrote about a process that as you're going through it, unlike any other campaign you might mount or campaign that you would have covered as a journalist, when you're going through this process, you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to share what's going on, and I understand that. And I accepted that when I received the honor of going through that process. And so I shared some of what occurred in those discussions. I'm not here to label anyone's questions or anyone's conduct one way or the other. But I wrote the book to talk about how it made me feel, how those questions landed on me, and how at the end of the day, after a really candid and frank and direct conversation with the former vice president, which to this day, I am grateful to her for her candor. I hope she's grateful to me for my candor back. We were able to reach the conclusion, Lori and I were, that evening after I met with former vice president, that was not the right place for me. It wasn't the best way for me to serve this country. And it wasn't the best way for me to continue to be a father and husband, which is why I picked up the phone and called her that evening about 48 hours before she made her final decision to let them know that they should make that decision without considering me in the process. So I share in that story the questions that were asked. You can form whatever judgments you want about what you think of those questions. I'm not here to label anyone else. I'm just here to tell you how I felt through that process.
So are you at all worried that by bringing this up in the book, that it'll only deepen divisions in the Democratic Party that's already pretty fractious?
I don't think it's deepening divisions, and I don't think our party is particularly fractious. I think we've got a number of wonderful leaders from across the political spectrum. We're all doing wonderful jobs. I happen to be sort of biased toward governors. I think there's some amazing governors, including your governor, who are leading the way across the country and being models and examples. It is true that we don't have one leader the way the Republican Party does in Donald Trump right now. But I would submit to you, that's okay. We're going to go through a process. We will select someone who best reflects the value of our party. But in the meantime, I think we should celebrate the extraordinary talent we have in our governor's offices, and members of Congress, and some mayors across this country who I think are doing great work.
But, I mean, there are divisions within the party, particularly about Israel. I mean, let's be honest about that. I mean, you have a mayor in New York who doesn't believe, he says Israel can exist, but he doesn't see Israel existing as a Jewish state. So what do you have to say to someone like Mayor Samdani about that position?
Well, we have profound differences on that. I've been very outspoken about that, both privately to him and publicly as well. And look, he was elected by the people of New York to lead that city. I was elected to lead the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And it goes back to the comment I made before. I think we've got people from across the political spectrum and a lot of talent in our party. And as we go through the process over the next few years, some overarching philosophy or view will emerge, and someone will emerge to lead that party forward. This is a healthy process that we're going to go through. I don't think this is something that we should be afraid of as Democrats. I think it's a process we should embrace. And I think what's important is when we come out the other side, we have a clear view of where we're going. And the where we're going can't be tied to just being the opposite of what Donald Trump says every day. It has to be tied to concrete things that are going to make people's lives better every day. That's what I do as governor of Pennsylvania. It's what Maura does here in Massachusetts, and even more of that.
So, I mean, that gets at something you pointed out in the book, and you said beyond the questions about Israel, about being an agent of Israel or anything like that,
Which I'm not.
Right. I didn't think so. You said that the questions about your ideology, your approach, and worldview suggested to you, as you wrote, that they really didn't understand where the people who had decided the presidential election really were. So what was it about that was out of touch? Where are the American people today? And where's the Democratic Party in terms of answering those needs?
Well, look, I'll just tell you, coming from Pennsylvania, one of the most politically divided states in the entire country, our registration is roughly even. We've got one Democratic U.S. Senator, one Republican U.S. Senator, a split congressional delegation. I oversee one of the nation's only divided legislatures. My House is led by Democrats by 1 vote. My Senate's led by Republicans by 2 votes. It doesn't get more divided than that. But yet we've found ways to actually come together to get stuff done. And it's largely because as I travel across our Commonwealth and from our farms to our downtowns, I listen to folks. And what I've learned is they all kind of basically want the same thing. They want a good school for their kid or their grandkid. They want a safe community for that kid or grandkid to live in. They want a job opportunity in a community they can love and afford to live in. And they want their rights and their freedoms protected. I hear that from farmers who voted for Trump, and I hear that from folks in Center City, Philadelphia, who voted for Harris. I think if you're willing to really listen to people and see that, then what you're able to do is work across the aisle to actually effectuate change and get stuff done in that space. That's what we've done in our Commonwealth, and I see that as indicative of what our country needs more. Focusing on the blocking and tackling of government and using government as a force for good in people's lives, for tangible things that they can see and feel that are going to make things better for them and their families.
So I wanted to get back to faith itself. What is it particularly about the Jewish faith that you were drawn to? In your book, you talk about the action of being Jewish as opposed to a history lesson. So what do you mean by that? What do you mean by faith?
I am not someone who goes to synagogue every day, but I pray every day. I'm not someone who reads the text and memorizes every passage of the Torah, but I feel like the lessons that I've learned over my lifetime, the call to action, the social justice sort of foundational values of my faith is, to me, central and what I am all about. So when I think about this, it's not necessarily about mastering the history or the words that are written in the text. It's about understanding the call to action that's rooted in our faith that drives me forward each and every day. And again, as I said at the top, many of those teachings I think are quite universal. I have been brought closer to my faith by virtue of showing up in Baptist churches in Pennsylvania or showing up at mosques, where I will hear from them how their faith is practiced or what their text says that draws them to go and help others or serve others, and it allows me to reflect on my own faith and find deeper meaning in it. I write in the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, that after the arson attack on my family and I, and as we were trying to heal and trying to find ways to lift ourselves up from that, I found comfort at Salem Baptist Church, listening to the congregation, listening to the pastor there preach and helping me find my center, helping me get closer to my faith and allow me to heal. And that's why I write that I think faith in many ways is universal. The text might be different, the prayers might be different, the places of worship may be different, but at the end of the day, those foundational values I think are very similar. And that is what I have learned through my faith and what I've been able to experience in other people's faith that have allowed me to get closer to mine.
So at least a couple of times in the book you mention William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania in 1681. He was a Quaker. But as you note, he saw Pennsylvania as a place where people of all faiths and all walks of life were welcome. Given that, I'm interested in what your reaction was to the Christmas messages last year that emanated from numerous agencies of the federal government. There were repeated references to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. That came from the White House and the Defense Department. And then the Department of Homeland Security said, we are blessed to share a nation and a Savior. So was it appropriate or inappropriate for federal agencies to send out messages that were so explicitly religious? Probably the most religious any of us has ever seen from the federal government.
I write at the end of the book about William Penn landing in Chester, Pennsylvania, along the Delaware River on a ship called Welcome in 1681. And he established Pennsylvania as a place that would be founded on three principles: free expression, free election, and freedom of religion. When I sit in my office as governor of Pennsylvania, I look up at the portraits of all those who came before me, and the one staring me right in the eye is William Penn. By the way, to my right is Ben Franklin. Imagine the pressure when you're working every day having those two guys down. But I feel a level of responsibility to carry that forward, and particularly as a person of faith, and a faith that has been persecuted in other countries. I feel a responsibility to ensure that all people can practice their faiths openly and freely in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and throughout the country. So when I see a message like that coming from the federal government, while I enjoy saying Merry Christmas to people, and I enjoy having Christmas trees at the governor's residence, leaning up on a wall where we have a mezuzah, right at the spot where we hosted a Ramadan, in the room where my kid had his bar mitzvah, right? William Penn would be proud of all that. I do find that using the tools of government to put your faith on others is very dangerous and very off-putting. And that is what I see the Trump administration doing. So wish someone a Merry Christmas. Using the power of the presidency to push your faith on others is something that I think makes people uncomfortable and is crossing a line that I think Penn would have hoped wouldn't be crossed.
So, it was a little surprise to hear you didn't have Andrew Jackson and James Monroe over your desk, but so,
Also, no gold in my office.
So you talked about the attack on the governor's mansion, and clearly that was a domestic attack that had a profound impact on you, and also the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27th that killed 11 congregants. October 27th, 2018, that killed 11 congregants. So I wondered if you could talk specifically about those two and what kind of lessons you drew from those attacks.
Well, first, let me tell you about what happened to my family and I, which I opened the book by talking about that. My family and I had welcomed the community and family to the governor's residence to celebrate the first night of Passover. And again, this was in the room, as I mentioned just a moment ago, where we have Christmas trees and we host iftar and we have people of all different faiths come together. And this was our moment to celebrate Passover. And like most Shapiro family events, it lasted way later than it should. And shortly after, I guess, midnight, we ended up leaving the state dining room and retiring upstairs to the living quarters and falling asleep. And just as we were falling asleep, got a bang on the door from the Pennsylvania State Police. We need to get out. There's a fire. And I will tell you at that moment, my only thought was get the 4 kids out, get the dogs out, make sure everybody's safe. Must be some issue in the kitchen. We'll go back in a few minutes. We learned a couple hours later that this was a targeted attack. That an arsonist had broken in with a metal hammer, fired Molotov cocktails around the governor's residence, and was trying to hunt me down and kill me with that hammer. He's in jail now for up to 50 years for his crimes for attempted murder and aggravated arson. I have tried not to dwell on the trauma of that moment, but instead I have tried to simply be a good father and a good husband coming out of that moment, to comfort our kids, to find ways to comfort my wife, First Lady of Pennsylvania, and to not be deterred in the work that I do and to not be afraid to do that work. What I did not expect coming out of that is how people from all different walks of life and all different faiths would come together and help us begin to heal. They would pray for us and strengthen us. And we've talked a lot about faith and my own faith here tonight. I am a prayerful person, but I never felt the power of other people's prayers before, particularly people of other faiths. I write in this book that after a couple days, we wanted to thank all of the firefighters who quite literally ran into the governor's residence as we were running out. So we made a meal for him. serve the meal, and at the conclusion of the meal, I'm talking to every one of the firefighters. A guy named John Wordle, an 82-year-old Republican from South Central Pennsylvania, and the Christian chaplain of the Penn Township Fire Department in Central Pennsylvania came over to me and said, I wrote down my favorite prayer for you. I wanted you to have it. It was a prayer from the book of Deuteronomy. And he said it was the most important prayer to him. What he didn't know is that that prayer he gave me that evening was the priestly blessing, the blessing that I recite over our 4 children each night. That is shared humanity. That is shared faith. And that is the power of prayer to heal and lift others up, a prayer that's coming from someone of a different faith. I saw a similar thing happen after the tragic killing at Tree of Life, the deadliest act of anti-Semitism in our nation's history in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After those killings, in the hours that followed, people from all faiths came together at the corner of Forbes and Murray, which is like the epicenter of the Squirrel Hill neighborhood in Pittsburgh, hand in hand, praying for one another, singing together, bringing comfort to one another, and saying in that community that we would be stronger than hate. The lines of religion blurred, but the lines of faith connected all of us. That next Saturday, that next Sabbath, the people who were at the mosque right near Tree of Life walked the Jews to another synagogue to pray to make sure they were safe. The Catholic Church opened up their doors to the Jewish community to make sure they had a place to be. Different religions shared faith. Both of those examples in Pennsylvania, to me, just deepened my commitment to my own faith and helped me see people of other faiths in a different way and understand our shared humanity.
So after the attack on the governor's mansion, we got immediate calls from President Biden, Obama, and Clinton, as well as foreign and business leaders. But it took a week for President Trump to call you. When you called him back, he asked you how you and the family were doing, and then you asked him how he was doing. And he launched into a monologue about tariffs, gas prices, economy, stock market. And then he said, you shouldn't want to be president given how dangerous it is to hold public office now. So I'm interested in what you made of his comments, especially given that it took a week for him to call you after someone tried to set your house and family on fire. And maybe also, if you'd like to, your thoughts on his advice about not running for president.
I'm not sure I'm going to take political advice from Donald Trump. Now, look, I appreciated that the president called that next week. It was funny. I was sitting by myself at the kitchen table having coffee, and it was the first day where I could kind of decompress after that week. And a call came in from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, and when I noticed a voicemail popped up just a couple minutes later, I hit the voicemail button, and there was Donald Trump leaving me this long message. Right as our 15-year-old son, Max, walked in, he goes, "Is that the president?" I go, "Yeah." Because he called you? I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Are you going to call him back?" And I said, "I am going to call him back." And look, I thought it was important as a father to show to his kid, you're going to respect the office, you can call the president back, and I did appreciate that he called. So I called him back. Max sat there, and as I write in the book, the first couple of minutes was very nice. I wanted to make sure we were taken care of. He had General Bondi and Director Patel call me and make sure we were okay, we had what we needed, and I did appreciate that. And to this day, I appreciate it. And then he began to tell me how his tariffs were working, even though the stock market was plummeting and prices were starting to go up. He was telling me how gas costs like $1.99 or something. I hadn't seen that anywhere. And then as we were getting into the issues, I figured I'd take the opportunity to lobby him on an important steelworker issue in Pennsylvania, which actually we ended up working together to resolve, which I thanked him for. And then he started to explain the rate of death per occupation in America, and he cited I think bull riders, presidents of the United States, and something else. And he said, I don't think you'd want to be president because it's got a really high, assassination rate. I just said, Mr. President, I'm not running for president, but I thank you for that word of caution, and I wish you the best, and I wish you safety. And look, to his credit, he said, keep in touch, and left me his number, and where we have been able to find ways to work together, we have, and as I think you've seen, I haven't hesitated to stand up to this administration and their lawlessness.
Well, bull riders and politicians have a lot in common, actually, right?
Gotta hold on.
So, yeah, right. So, switching gears here, I do want to talk about the subject that I mentioned right at the beginning, and was the reason we met in 2018. So, a signature moment of your political career was your time as Attorney General in Pennsylvania, when your office conducted a two-year investigation of widespread abuse of children by Catholic Church clergy. As I mentioned before, the grand jury report released in 2018 revealed that more than 1,000 children, possibly some multiple of that, were abused by at least 300 Catholic priests in 6 Pennsylvania dioceses since in 1950. And the church hierarchy had covered it up. And of course, it fought to keep the grand jury report secret as well. So, and that had a profound impact on you. And I wondered if you could just talk a bit about what kind of impact that did have on you. And also to address a portion of the book where you say you leaned more heavily on your faith as a result of that. And then the last part of that is that you said you had questioned how God could let this happen to these innocent children. And I'm wondering what your answer is to that.
Maybe I'll get to that part last, because I'm still struggling with the answer to that. In 2017, I was sworn in as Pennsylvania's Attorney General. And when you're sworn in and you go through the grand jury process to learn, what's been going on and sort of set yourself on directions of various investigations, I learned that there was an early investigation going on into what seemed like a limited abuse by a couple or handful of priests against a number of children, which is awful. And I was asked, do you want to continue this investigation as a new Attorney General? I said, of course. And I said, I think we should be aggressive, and we should dig, and we should see what we can learn. I write in the book about how my parents' experiences in life sensitized me to kids who had rough childhoods, kids who were abused, and I wanted to be there to protect those kids. I wanted to be there to help them, and I was going to follow the evidence wherever it led. As we went through this process, and you should understand, I know, Marty, you do, grand jury processes are secret. So secret that if you share the information, you actually would go to jail. In fact, my predecessor as Attorney General spent 6 months in jail because she shared secret grand jury information. And so in many ways, as you go through this investigation, you're completely cloistered from the normal people who would be your outlets in life. I write in this book about how Yori is the person I talk to every day about everything. And yet this was a subject I couldn't talk to her about. As we got further and further and further into this investigation, ultimately finding that there were over 300 predator priests who abused thousands of children in Pennsylvania, I found myself more and more isolated from the people around me. I'd come home at night and see my kids, and I was withdrawn from them. Where sometimes I'd be all over them, hugging them and trying to protect them, and my kids just thought I was being weird. But I was dealing with all of this information at work that I couldn't share with the people closest to me. And yet I just kept wanting to dig and dig and dig and get to the truth. I would note, one of the reasons I wanted Marty here tonight asking these questions is survivor after survivor would tell us that they found the courage to speak up or find the courage to testify before the grand jury because of Spotlight and because of the reporting that Marty did. And ultimately, the community that was notified. It started here in Massachusetts, led to a reckoning in Pennsylvania. which has led to a reckoning across the globe. I will tell you that as I went through that process, I was so enraged by these priests using the tools of their faith to abuse children, abusing a child, and then making them drink the holy water to say that they would be cleansed from the abuse that that priest just put upon them. It's one example. I was enraged by it, and I wanted to get at the truth. We eventually did. And as I came through that process and ultimately was able to talk to Lori again about it, to share with her what happened, I did find myself questioning faith. Not because anything like that ever happened to me in my faith or that I was aware of anything like that happening in my faith, but the fact that it could be used as a tool, these tools of faith used to abuse people, was something I really struggled to reckon with. Looking back on it, it may be a moment in my life where I began to withdraw more from religious institutions, but to pray a lot more and to feel a deeper connection to my own faith. I certainly didn't appreciate it at the time. I think I'm beginning to understand it more now. That was by far the hardest thing I've ever done in my career, digging and digging and digging, and ultimately being able to come out with that grand jury report. And I would argue it may be the most purposeful thing we did, by giving those survivors some feeling that they were finally believed after being distrustful of law enforcement, after being distrustful of people in positions of authority, and of course after being distrustful of these leaders of their faith. I'm grateful to those victims for having the courage to speak up. They taught me so much, and I continue to be inspired by them, and I continue to work for them and others who have been abused and others who have been put upon by the powerful to this day as a result of that. And Marty, I really, really cannot stress enough how thankful the world is for the reporting you did here in Boston that led to reckonings all across the globe. We appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the nice words, and in exchange, I'm not going to ask you any more pointed questions. Is that fair?
That's great.
Okay, good. But actually, so the question, how God could let this happen to these innocent children, have you come up with an answer to that?
I haven't. In some ways, I look to the survivors who I feel blessed to have gotten to know, not just through their grand jury testimony or through their courage in a courtroom, but that I've gotten to know throughout that process and stayed connected to in the years since. Many of them have withdrawn from Catholicism, but a whole bunch of them still go to church regularly and still believe in God. And they, I think in many ways, kind of answer that question for me.
So I want to discuss in a bit more depth the state of the Democratic Party.
I thought we weren't doing that anymore.
You said that there were hardly any divisions in the party, but I don't know, beg to differ.
I think there's differences for sure, and I think we should be proud of the differences.
Okay, well, let me ask you about the Republican Party, because more comfortable talking about that. So when you were running for governor in 2022, your wife, Lori, reacting to the news of the day, said these Republicans love to claim that they're for freedom, but they are full of, well, you can guess the word. So, and she went on to explain that, and you took notes on that, you used those ideas in closing out your campaign. In your view, is the Republican Party anti-freedom? And are things like freedom and the rule of law genuinely effective issues for Democrats, or is it just the economy?
Okay. I'll answer your question. I want to share the story with you because I think it speaks to the kind of relationship Lori and I have and how much I learned from her and I lean on her. A friend of mine read this book and they said, I thought you wrote a political book. I said, no, I wrote a book about family and faith and service. So no, you wrote a love story to your wife. We've been together since the 9th grade, so you'll learn all kinds of embarrassing things about me in this book. But Laura and I'd been campaigning for governor, It's nonstop in a big state. You're not home a lot. You're on the road. And it was a Monday morning. We had just gotten the kids off to school, and we sat down at the table with our coffee, our morning news, and the last thing I wanted to do was talk about politics, the race, or anything like that. And Lori, out of nowhere, she was reading something, and she said, you know, these Republicans are so full of shit when it comes to freedom. You know, they talk a good game about freedom, but it's not freedom to tell me what I can do with my body. It's not freedom to tell me what medicines I'm on. Instead of she was reacting to a story about how they were trying to take mifepristone away. And she goes, and by the way, it's not freedom to tell my kids what books they're allowed to read and sanction certain books. And she's going on and on and on, and I don't want to be thinking about this moment. But I knew she was onto something. So the kids had left their homework on the table on a pencil. So I flipped over the homework, hoping that Lori wouldn't notice, and I began writing down what she was saying. And it was all about, it's not freedom when they do this. I folded it up. I took it with me as I left the campaign for about 4 days or so. And during the first, 3 3/4 days, I was kind of given the same speech over and over again about the issues that were important in Pennsylvania. And then we got to the final event before the primary election, and I had this piece of paper still in my pocket. And I looked at my staff and I said, I think I'm going to take freedom out for a spin. I think Lori is right, and I think we need to talk about this more. And I stood up in this ballroom in Erie, Pennsylvania, and I said, it's not freedom to tell women what they're allowed to do with their bodies. It's not freedom to tell our kids what books they're allowed to read. It's not freedom to tell someone that they can go work a 40-hour work week, but they can't join a union. And it sure as hell isn't freedom to say, you can go vote, but they get to pick the winners. That's not freedom. And I got a whole lot of cheers for that. And you would think, okay, well, that's the message. But there was something nagging at me, I read in the book, that was just a negative on the Republicans. And to answer your question, I don't believe they're the party of freedom, and they are proving that every day by taking away our liberties and taking away our rights. But over the next months of the campaign, I was able to then instead talk about freedom in affirmative tones. What happens if we invest in that kid's school and give her a shot? And make sure we hire more police so that kid is safe in their community. And give that kid the ability to learn welding in high school so that she can go out and get a job and make a good living. And she can marry who she loves and create a job and have economic opportunity in the place where she wants to live. And so we ended up with an affirmative vision of freedom. And to answer your question, does that work politically? I'm here, and I got more votes than anybody else in the history of Pennsylvania. So I think it has something to do with it. And I say that not in any way to pat myself on the back. I say that because empirically, the people that voted for that, yeah, they were Democrats. But there were a whole lot of people who were independents and Republicans as well. Because people in this country value freedom and liberty. I was joking with Maura. She said, we filled out the paperwork, but you all got things started here. And the truth is, I think we both have responsibilities for the birth of this nation 250 years ago, but we are a freedom-loving people. And what we are seeing now from this administration every day is restricting our freedoms, telling women what they can do with their bodies. A guy like RFK Jr. telling me what vaccines I can give to my kid, as opposed to letting a doctor decide that. Stopping someone on the street in Minnesota because they have an accent? That's not freedom. That's not who we are as Americans. And so I believe the Democratic Party, for as broad and diverse and different as we are, to your questions, we are the party of freedom. We are the party of liberty, and we are going to continue to stand on the side of freedom and liberty as we go forward.
Wrapping up my questions here, and then we'll get to the audience questions, although I could go on a few hours. But you talk in the book about the importance of reaching across the political aisle to Republicans, of building coalitions, even about nuance in making policy. You say you have to build coalitions even with people you disagree with. You speak of your policy of cutting business taxes, regulatory reform, support for more police. But you also talk about an environment of political nihilism, as you put it. And you say compromise is possible. It may not feel comfortable all the time. It'll take patience. But it does appear that a lot of activists in both parties actually don't seem to want compromise. They just want a battle, a war. They want people they see as warriors. So and they see compromise as capitulation and a failure of principle. Is it capitulation? Is it a failure of principle? How do you see compromise? And is there support for that within your own party?
I've never compromised my values, but I sit at the table with people of the opposing party to find common ground. And I think those are two very distinct things. I don't ask Republicans when I'm negotiating with them to give up on their values or their principles. But if we sit down at the table and have an honest dialogue as we do, we talk about 10 issues. We may agree on 3 or 4 of them, but not the other 6 or 7 of them. I don't focus on the 6 or 7 where we differ. I try and get something done on the 3 or 4. Why? Because that's what we are supposed to do in government. Make people's lives better. And the way you make people's lives better, at least in my state and in states where there's some political division, is you find ways to work together. I understand that our social media companies profit off of division and profit off of the loudest voices. I understand that oftentimes the sexy stories in the media are the ones where people are fighting instead of the ones where people are doing the hard work together at the table to get stuff done. Look, I'll take a backseat to no one in standing up to this administration when they mess with the Pennsylvanian, where they try and undermine your constitutional rights. But I also know that I got to go to the office every day and figure out a way to give a kid a better education and make sure she's got a safer community. Make sure we've got jobs and economic growth in my state. That's the work I do every day, and that requires people coming together and finding common ground. And I will tell you, as I write in the book, from my first experience listening to the voters, when I went out and knocked on 18,000 doors in a state representative race where nobody thought I could win. It was an overwhelmingly Republican district. But I learned in that race to listen to the people that I wanted to represent. And to this day, I continue to listen to them. They want us to work together and find common ground while continuing to stand up for your principles. It is not an either or. You can stand up for your principles and find common ground, and we're doing that in Pennsylvania.
We have at least about 10 minutes. Not sure. So I wanted to get to the audience questions. Great. It's a little easier on you than I am. But so one other question: as governors are increasingly dealing with the impacts of immigration policy, what do you think is missing from the national conversation, and what should citizens be pushing their leaders to be different?
Well, let's be clear. Our immigration system is broken in the United States, and it has been broken for more than a decade. And I'll also say something that may make some people in here uncomfortable. Democrats are to blame, and Republicans are to blame. Here's what I believe we need. We need a secure border. We need to say to people who have been living lawfully here in this country that we're going to create a path to legal status for you here in this country. And for those who want to come to America, we want immigrants to come to America. We need to make sure there are clear rules of the road for them to enter and to do so legally. I think immigration has helped strengthen and shape our nation in really positive ways. We have to keep doing that, but we've got to do it in a constructive and thoughtful way. What we saw in the Biden administration without having a secure border was not the answer. And what we're seeing right now from the Trump administration in Minnesota, sure as hell, is not the answer. I believe that the mission in Minnesota and the mission elsewhere that has been directed by this president and carried out by ICE and by CBP is a mission that is compromised and is a mission that is not adhering to people, protecting people's constitutional rights. It is outside the bounds of the law. I believe this mission needs to be terminated immediately. And I think there are 3 ways that can happen. First, I think the court needs to hold that the federal government is violating the 10th Amendment rights of the people of Minnesota. Second, the Congress of the United States, by Friday, needs to stop funding missions like this. And third, I think the people have a powerful voice here. You have seen the outrage coming from people of all different walks of life, from all different states. Donald Trump has responded to that. Now, I want to be clear. Just pushing Noam out of Minnesota doesn't make the situation better, because the direction is coming from the top that people's constitutional rights are to be violated. That needs to change. And the way that changes is by people continuing to speak up, by ending this mission, ending the funding, and limiting the ways in which the spending can occur. I will tell you, this is deeply, deeply concerning to me. We're preparing as though it's coming to Pennsylvania next. We will be prepared. I know your governor is prepared, and we'll have more to say on that very soon. And I will just tell you, this to me is not who we are as Americans, and this is not a cogent policy, and this is not where we need to go on immigration policy for this country, what the Trump administration is doing right now.
As someone leading during a time of intense division, what's been the hardest moment where you had to choose between political safety and doing what you believed was right?
Yeah, I'm someone who prides myself, I read about the book, on not kind of shifting with the political winds, while also finding ways to listen and be willing to adapt my position and learn from others. I write in this book about how when I campaigned for Attorney General, and twice and won both times, I campaigned both times in support of the death penalty. I thought the death penalty should be limited to the most heinous of cases, but I supported it, very genuine. And then I noticed during my time as Attorney General, when cases would come across my desk where capital punishment could be an option, I couldn't do it. I was finding myself more and more saying, we should go for life in prison on this really awful case. One day, about 6 years ago, our son Max, who was about 11 at the time, was watching TV, watching the Sixers game. I had to get a Sixers plug in here with all you Celtics. And he said, Dad, I go, yeah. He goes, we don't have the death penalty in Pennsylvania, do we? And I said, what makes you ask that? I was just curious. And I said, well, we do have the death penalty in Pennsylvania. He goes, well, you don't believe in that, do you? 11-year-old son. And I said, well, son, in the most heinous of cases, and I began giving the answer I'd given. And he goes, I don't understand why killing someone as a punishment for them killing someone is the answer. And if you've ever had one of those moments where you can't look your kid in the eye, to me, that was that moment. And I walked away feeling pretty crappy about myself as a dad, and really, really questioning if I was in the right place on this. I share this story because the polling on this was overwhelming in my state in support of the death penalty. I really, really grappled with it after that conversation with Max. I launched my campaign for governor shortly thereafter, and I was in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is like on the border of Ohio. And out of nowhere, this local reporter asked me in the first week of my campaign for governor, what's your view on the death penalty? And I proudly articulated my new position, which was I would not support the death penalty. I'd have a moratorium, and I would never sign an execution warrant if I was elected governor of a Commonwealth, and that I would push not to reform the death penalty, but to rescind the death penalty, because the state should not be in the business of killing people and putting people to death. I share that story with you because I guess I went against what was politically popular then, and by the way, what is continuing to be politically popular today. But that was a matter of conscience. It was a matter of listening to my gut, listening to my kid, and frankly, listening to the people that I'd encountered in the criminal justice process as their attorney general. And that's an example of not shifting with the political winds, but being open and willing to learn, to listen, and to change your position. Changing your position is a sign of strength, I believe. I think in positions like mine, you then have a responsibility to explain to people why you changed your position, what led you to that. And that is what I later did as governor. And that first execution warrant came across my desk, and I didn't sign.
I want to ask
Got some fans of Josh Shapiro, I guess.
I never want to interrupt your applause. No. So the final question, I'll take that myself. In the book, you reflect on whether the dangers of politics, notably in the aftermath of the arson attack on the Pennsylvania governor's mansion, and the impact on your family. How do you talk about that? Is the pressure on your family and the safety risks, is it worth it? You sort of raised that issue. And by the way, the pressures of a presidential campaign and the presidency itself are even greater than those on a governor. And so are you and your family up for that?
I will tell you that before we decided to run for re-election, which I just announced earlier this month, we talked a lot about it as a family. Was this something that we wanted to do again? Was this something that we were prepared to do? Was this something that my kids were comfortable with, our kids were comfortable with? Was Lori going to be all in? And frankly, was I going to be comfortable knowing that continuing to pursue this career I love that we read about in the book, that I feel like my parents and my faith guided me toward, even though I didn't have a clue as I was growing up that I'd end up here talking to all of you today in this position, but that love could lead to putting my family's lives at risk. I'm still working through that. I'm still kind of coming to terms and grappling with the emotional scars from that and trying to carry that as a dad and as a public servant. But I will tell you, my family and I were all in for this. And we know that walking away in the face of these threats, not just threats to me, but the kind of threats we saw just last night to Congresswoman Omar, and we saw the Speaker of Portland in Minnesota, Charlie Kirk in Utah, President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania. Those threats are very real. But I feel such passion and such drive to serve, particularly at this moment in our American story, that I can't walk away. 250 years we've been doing this. And the brilliance of our founders is that for as great as Maura said that paperwork was in Philadelphia that they signed, the beauty of it is it was incomplete. And they left the work to the next generation. My faith teaches me that it's my responsibility to do that work. And so I'm certainly not going to walk away. I'm going to stand up to the bullies. We're going to protect ourselves, but I'm going to stand up to the bullies, and I'm going to keep doing this work. And I'm incredibly humbled and grateful that you're all here tonight to learn about the story of service. And I so appreciate you buying the book and giving me the time tonight. Thank you.